Fire her. Right now. The billionaire's voice echoed across the luxury restaurant as every conversation suddenly stopped. Alexander Hale, one of the richest and most feared men in the city, pointed angrily at the young waitress standing beside his table. "This is the worst service I've ever had," he snapped. "If she's still working here when I come back, I'll make sure this place never sees another dollar from me." The young waitress stood silently for a moment, gripping her notepad tightly as dozens of eyes stared at her. Most people in her position would have apologized, begged, or walked away in tears. But she didn't. Instead, she slowly looked him straight in the eyes. Then she said something that made the billionaire's expression suddenly change. "Go ahead," she said calmly. "Fire me if you want." Hello family, welcome to True Life Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The soft glow of golden chandeliers reflected off polished marble floors as quiet music floated through the luxurious restaurant. It was the kind of place where powerful people came to relax, sign business deals, or celebrate success. Every table was decorated perfectly, every glass sparkling clean. For the staff, perfection wasn't just expected, it was required. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different. Near the entrance, the restaurant manager suddenly rushed in from outside, his face tense. "He's here," he whispered sharply. The few staff members who heard him immediately stiffened. "Who?" one of the waiters asked nervously. The manager lowered his voice even further. "Alexander Hale." The name spread across the room like electricity. A few waitresses exchanged uneasy glances while another waiter quietly cursed under his breath. Oh great, not tonight. Everyone in the city knew Alexander Hale. By the age of 38, he had built one of the most powerful technology companies in the country. His wealth was unimaginable, his influence even greater. Newspapers called him a genius, investors admired him, and young entrepreneurs dreamed of becoming like him. But those who worked in places he visited knew a different side of him. Alexander Hale was brilliant, but he was also known for his cold temper and impossible standards. One small mistake was enough to ruin someone's entire shift or their job. The manager clapped his hands quietly to get everyone's attention. "Listen carefully," he said. "Mr. Hale will be sitting at table 12 like usual. Everything must be perfect. No delays, no mistakes." A young waitress sighed nervously. "Last time he came here, he yelled at Jason for bringing the wrong wine." "That wasn't even Jason's fault," another waiter whispered. "Doesn't matter," someone replied quietly. "When Alexander Hale is angry, someone always pays for it." The manager looked around the room. "All right," he said cautiously. "Who's taking table 12? Silence. Every single employee suddenly became very interested in their menus, trays, or napkins. Nobody volunteered. Nobody even made eye contact with the manager. He sighed heavily. "Come on, someone has to do it." Still nothing. At that moment, a calm voice spoke from behind them. "I'll take it." Everyone turned around. Standing near the service counter was Elena Carter, the newest waitress in the restaurant. She had only started working there a few weeks earlier. Unlike the others, she wasn't trembling or whispering nervously. She simply tied her apron a little tighter and stepped forward. The manager frowned slightly. "Elena, are you sure?" She nodded. "A customer is a customer," she said calmly. "That's what we're here for." One of the waiters shook his head. "You don't understand," he warned her quietly. "Alexander Hale isn't like normal customers." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Does he bite?" "No," the waiter muttered. "But he might destroy your entire career." A few nervous chuckles passed through the group, but the tension remained. The manager hesitated, then finally nodded. "All right, but be careful." Across the restaurant, the large glass doors opened. A tall man walked in, his presence immediately commanding attention. Alexander Hale. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, his expression sharp and impatient. A bodyguard remained near the entrance while Alexander moved confidently toward his usual table, without even glancing around. The staff instinctively stepped aside as he passed. He sat down at table 12 and pulled out his phone, already scrolling through messages as if the entire room barely existed. The manager leaned closer to Elena. "Remember," he whispered, Be polite, be quick, and whatever happens, stay calm. Elena gave a small nod. Picking up her notepad, she walked toward the table. Each step seemed louder than the last as the other staff members secretly watched from a distance. Elena stopped beside the table and spoke politely. Good evening, sir. My name is Elena, and I'll be serving you tonight. Alexander barely looked up from his phone. Water, he said flatly. Sparkling. And make it quick. Of course, Elena replied with a professional smile. She returned moments later with the water and waited patiently while he continued typing on his phone. Finally, he glanced up briefly. I'll have the grilled salmon, he said. Medium. With steamed vegetables. No sauce. She wrote it down quickly. Anything else, sir? Alexander looked at her for a second longer than expected, as if evaluating something. Then he simply waved his hand dismissively. That's all. Very well, Elena said calmly before walking back toward the kitchen. Behind the counter, the other staff members immediately surrounded her. Well, one waitress whispered. Did he yell yet? Elena shook her head slightly. No, she said calmly. He just ordered dinner. The waiter who had warned her earlier looked unconvinced. Give it time. In the kitchen, the chefs quickly prepared Alexander's order with extreme care. Everyone knew mistakes with his food could cause serious trouble. Minutes later, Elena carefully carried the plate out to table 12 and placed it in front of him. Your grilled salmon, sir. Alexander nodded slightly without looking up. For a moment, everything seemed perfectly normal. But just as Elena turned to walk away, Alexander suddenly stopped moving. His eyes narrowed as he looked down at the plate. Slowly, he placed his fork on the table. Elena, he said coldly. She turned back. Yes, sir? Alexander pushed the plate slightly forward. This is not what I ordered. The calm atmosphere in the restaurant shattered instantly. Nearby customers looked up. The manager froze. And the staff watching from a distance silently prayed that the situation wouldn't explode. But they were already too late. Because in the next few seconds, Alexander Hale's anger would ignite a confrontation that none of them would ever forget. And it would lead to a revelation that would change his life forever. Alexander pushed the plate forward slowly, his expression tightening as he examined the food in front of him. This is not what I ordered. The words were quiet, but the cold irritation in his voice immediately drew attention. Conversations around the restaurant began to fade as nearby diners sensed tension building. Elena remained standing beside the table, calm but alert. I'm sorry, sir, she said politely. Could you tell me what seems to be wrong with it? Alexander pointed his fork toward the plate. I said medium, he replied sharply. This is overcooked. Elena looked at the salmon. From where she stood, it seemed perfectly prepared, but she knew arguing about food with an irritated customer rarely helped. I apologize for that, she said. I can have the kitchen prepare a new one for you right away. Alexander leaned back in his chair slowly, studying her face as if searching for something. That's not the point, he said. A few tables away, the manager had already noticed the tension and began walking toward them quickly. The point, Alexander continued, his voice growing louder, is that when I order something, I expect it to be done correctly the first time. I understand, Elena replied calmly. Alexander scoffed. Do you? The manager finally reached the table, forcing a nervous smile. Mr. Hale, I'm very sorry about this. We'll fix it immediately. Alexander didn't even look at him. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on Elena. Is she new? He asked. The manager hesitated. Yes, she started a few weeks ago. That explains it, Alexander muttered. Elena could feel the other staff members watching from across the room. She knew exactly what they were expecting her to do, apologize repeatedly and try to calm him down. But something about his tone stirred a quiet frustration inside her. She had done nothing wrong. The delay had come from the kitchen, and the chef himself had checked the dish before sending it out. Still, she kept her voice respectful. I can replace the dish immediately, sir. Alexander suddenly slammed his fork onto the table. The sharp metallic sound echoed across the restaurant. I don't want it replaced, he snapped. The manager's heart nearly stopped. Sir. Alexander raised a hand to silence him. This is exactly what's wrong with places like this, he said coldly. Careless staff who don't pay attention. Elena took a slow breath. With respect, sir, I simply delivered the meal prepared by the kitchen. Alexander's eyes narrowed. Are you arguing with me? No, she replied evenly. I'm explaining the situation. The manager quickly stepped forward, desperate to stop the conversation from escalating. Elena, he said quietly, please just apologize. But Elena didn't move. Something in Alexander's expression suddenly changed. He looked almost amused now, as if he had just discovered an unexpected challenge. You've got confidence, he said slowly. Then his face hardened again. But confidence doesn't make up for incompetence. The manager forced another smile. Mr. Hale, I promise we'll handle this. Alexander cut him off with a single sharp sentence. Fire her. The words landed like a bomb. The manager froze. I'm sorry. You heard me, Alexander said. I don't want someone like that serving me or anyone else here. The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Even customers at distant tables were staring openly. The manager shifted nervously. Mr. Hale, perhaps that's a little extreme. It may not have been her fault. Alexander's voice turned icy. Are you questioning me? No, sir, but… I spend a lot of money in this place, Alexander interrupted. And when I say someone shouldn't be working here, I expect that to be taken seriously. The manager swallowed hard. He knew how powerful Alexander Hale was. Losing him as a regular customer could cost the restaurant an enormous amount of business. He turned slowly toward Elena, clearly uncomfortable. Elena, maybe you should step away for now. But Elena didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on Alexander. For the first time since the confrontation began, there was something deeper than anger in her expression. Something personal. Alexander noticed it immediately. What? He said impatiently. Elena spoke quietly, but every word carried through the silent room. You really don't recognize me, do you? Alexander frowned. Recognize you? Yes. He gave a short laugh. Why would I recognize a waitress? The words hung in the air. Elena crossed her arms slowly. For a moment, it looked like she was deciding whether or not to say something. Then she finally spoke. I never thought, she said steadily, that my own father would try to get me fired. The entire restaurant froze. The manager blinked in shock. Several customers gasped quietly. Alexander stared at her as if he had just misheard the sentence. What did you say? Elena didn't look away. I said, she repeated, I never thought my own father would try to get me fired. Alexander leaned back in his chair slowly. Then he laughed. A cold, dismissive laugh. That's ridiculous, he said. I don't have any children. Elena's expression didn't change. Are you sure about that? Alexander's smile faded slightly. He studied her face more carefully now. Something about her suddenly felt familiar. But that was impossible. You're either confused, he said sharply, or trying some kind of stunt. Elena reached up and pulled a thin necklace from beneath her uniform. A small silver pendant hung from it. Alexander's eyes immediately locked onto it. The color drained from his face. Because he recognized that necklace instantly. He had given it to someone 20 years ago. Someone he had never seen again. Elena's voice was calm, but her eyes burned with emotion. My mother's name is Lydia Carter. The name hit Alexander like a punch to the chest. The restaurant, the people, the noise, everything around him seemed to disappear in that moment. Memories he had buried for decades suddenly rushed back into his mind. And for the first time since becoming one of the most powerful men in the city, Alexander Hale felt something he hadn't felt in years. Confusion, shock, and a growing, terrifying possibility. Because if what she was saying was true, then the young waitress standing in front of him wasn't just a stranger he had humiliated. She was his daughter. For several long seconds, Alexander Hale didn't move. The noise of the restaurant slowly returned around him. Quiet whispers, clinking glasses, the distant hum of conversation. But it all sounded strangely distant. His eyes remained fixed on the small silver necklace hanging from Elena's hand. He knew that necklace. There was no doubt about it. 20 years ago, on a warm summer night filled with music and laughter, he had placed that same necklace around the neck of the girl he loved. Lydia Carter. Alexander stood up slowly from his chair. Where did you get that? He asked, his voice suddenly low and unsteady. Elena didn't look intimidated anymore. If anything, her confidence had grown. My mother kept it, she said. Alexander shook his head, still staring at the pendant. That's impossible. Is it? Elena replied quietly. The manager looked back and forth between them, completely lost. Mr. Hale, is everything all right? Alexander ignored him. His attention was locked entirely on the young woman standing in front of him. Now that he looked closely, he noticed things he hadn't seen before. Her eyes, the shape of her face, even the way she stood with quiet determination. Something about her felt disturbingly familiar. What did you say your mother's name was? He asked again. Elena Carter, she said firmly. My mother is Lydia Carter. The name landed heavily in the air between them. Alexander ran a hand through his hair as memories began pushing their way into his mind. He remembered Lydia clearly now. They had met in their final year of high school. She was kind, strong-willed, and far more grounded than he had been back then. While he spent most of his time talking about business ideas and dreams of success, Lydia had always reminded him to slow down and enjoy life. They had been inseparable for nearly 2 years, until one day she disappeared. No explanation. No goodbye. Just gone. Alexander had searched for her at first, asking friends, checking places she used to visit. But eventually he convinced himself she had simply decided to move on. He had buried the pain beneath ambition, building the empire that eventually made him famous. And now, suddenly, her name was standing in front of him, inside a crowded restaurant, claiming to be his daughter. That can't be right, he muttered. Elena tilted her head slightly. Why not? Alexander's voice sharpened. Because Lydia would have told me if she had a child. Elena's expression hardened. She tried. Alexander looked up sharply. What do you mean she tried? Elena took a slow breath before answering. She came to see you once. Alexander blinked. When? When she found out she was pregnant. The word struck him like a shock. He felt the air leave his lungs. That's not possible. Elena continued calmly, though there was clear emotion beneath her voice. She went to your family's house. She said she waited outside for nearly an hour before someone finally spoke to her. Alexander's brow furrowed. Who? Your father. The mention of his father sent a chill through him. His father had been a powerful businessman, strict, controlling, and obsessed with reputation. What did he say? Alexander asked quietly. Elena's eyes darkened. He told her she wasn't welcome. Alexander felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He told her that if she tried to ruin your future with a story about pregnancy, he would make sure she regretted it. The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Alexander stared at her in disbelief. My father wouldn't. He did, Elena interrupted. The firmness in her voice made him stop. She was scared, Elena continued. She was only 18. She had nowhere to go and no one willing to believe her. Alexander's mind raced. If this was true, then everything he believed about Lydia leaving him was wrong. She said she waited for you to come home, Elena added softly. Alexander's chest tightened. But your father told her you didn't want to see her. He clenched his fist slowly. My father said that? Elena nodded. She believed him. Alexander suddenly felt a wave of anger building in his chest. Anger mixed with confusion and regret. For 20 years, he had believed Lydia abandoned him. But what if the truth was the opposite? What happened after that? He asked quietly. Elena looked down for a moment before answering. She left town. And you? I was born a few months later. Alexander lowered himself back into the chair, as if his legs could no longer support his weight. You're saying she raised you alone? Elena nodded. She worked 2 jobs most of the time. Sometimes 3. A few nearby customers were still listening, stunned by the unfolding conversation. Elena continued. She cleaned houses, worked in diners, did whatever she had to do to keep us afloat. Alexander felt something unfamiliar pressing against his chest. Guilt. But she never hated you, Elena added. Alexander looked up slowly. What? She always told me you were a good man once. The sentence hurt more than any accusation. Once, he repeated quietly. Elena met his gaze. She said you had dreams of changing the world, that you were kind and hopeful. She gestured around the restaurant. But when I saw you tonight, her voice trailed off. Alexander knew exactly what she meant. The arrogant billionaire shouting at a waitress. The man who had just tried to destroy her job. I searched for Lydia for a while after she disappeared, he said defensively. I thought she just left. Elena studied him carefully. Did you search for long? Alexander didn't answer. Because the truth was painful. He had stopped searching once his business career began taking off. Ambition had taken over everything. Elena slowly placed something on the table. An old photograph. Alexander looked down. It showed a younger version of himself standing beside Lydia at a beach. They were both laughing, the wind blowing through their hair. He remembered that day perfectly. You gave that to her, Elena said. Alexander's voice was barely audible. Yes. Elena crossed her arms again. She kept it all these years. Alexander stared at the photo, his thoughts spinning. Then he looked back up at her. You expect me to believe you're my daughter because of a necklace and an old photo? Elena didn't flinch. No, she said calmly. Then she leaned slightly closer to him. I expect you to believe it because when you look at me, you already know it might be true. Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Because deep down, something inside him had already begun to realize the terrifying possibility. And if it was true, then the worst part wasn't that he had a daughter he never knew about. It was that the first thing he had done after meeting her was humiliate her in front of an entire restaurant. For several long moments, Alexander Hale couldn't bring himself to speak. The elegant restaurant around them slowly returned to life. The clink of glasses, quiet conversations, the soft music drifting through the room. But at table 12, time seemed frozen. Alexander stared at the objects lying on the table. The silver necklace. The old photograph. His chest felt tight. Across from him, Elena Carter stood calmly, her posture straight, her expression steady. But there was something behind her eyes now. Years of quiet pain. Questions that had waited too long for answers. Alexander leaned back slowly in his chair and ran a hand across his face. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. Elena didn't react. Doesn't it? She asked quietly. Alexander shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. If Lydia had been pregnant, she would have told me. She tried, Elena replied. The words landed harder this time. Alexander looked up sharply. You already said that. Yes, Elena said calmly. And you didn't believe me. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The manager stood a few feet away, pretending to rearrange a nearby table, but clearly listening. Several customers had stopped pretending not to watch. Alexander looked down at the photograph again. He remembered that day vividly. The beach. The wind. Lydia laughing beside him. Back then, everything had seemed simple. Why didn't she come find me again? He asked quietly. Elena's expression hardened slightly. Because your father made sure she wouldn't. Alexander's jaw tightened. My father is dead, he said sharply. That doesn't change what he did. The words hung in the air. Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. So your mother just disappeared and raised you alone for 20 years, he asked. Elena nodded. She worked wherever she could. Cleaning houses. Working in diners. Sometimes 2 jobs at once. Alexander swallowed. The image of Lydia, young, bright, full of life, clashed painfully with the picture Elena was painting. And she never tried to contact me again, he asked. Elena studied him carefully. Do you know what it feels like to be turned away by someone powerful? She asked quietly. Alexander didn't answer. She believed you didn't want her, Elena continued. That you had chosen your future over her. Alexander's chest tightened. That's not true. But she didn't know that, Elena replied. Silence returned. Alexander stared at the table, his mind racing through memories he hadn't touched in decades. Finally, he spoke again. I did look for her, he said. Elena tilted her head. For how long? Alexander didn't answer. Because the truth was embarrassing. Not long enough. His business had started growing shortly after Lydia disappeared. Opportunities came. Investors. Success. And slowly he stopped searching. Elena seemed to understand the silence without needing an explanation. That's what I thought, she said quietly. The words stung more than an accusation would have. Alexander looked up at her. For the first time since the confrontation began, his voice softened. I didn't know, he said. Elena crossed her arms. But you know now. He nodded slowly. Yes. His eyes drifted back to the necklace. He remembered buying it from a small jewelry shop near their school. It had cost almost all the money he had at the time. I gave that to her the night before graduation, he murmured. She never took it off, Elena replied. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. The guilt pressing against his chest felt heavier by the second. When he opened them again, he looked directly at Elena. So what now? He asked quietly. Elena didn't hesitate. That depends on you. Alexander leaned forward. Where is she? The question carried a mixture of hope and fear. Elena studied him carefully, searching his face. You want to see her? She asked. Alexander almost laughed at the question. Yes. Why? Because I need to know the truth, he replied. Elena's expression didn't change. That's not a good enough reason. Alexander frowned. What do you mean? You humiliated me tonight, she said calmly. Before you even knew who I was. Alexander winced slightly. I know. And now suddenly you want to play the role of father? Her words were sharp, but not angry. Just honest. Alexander sat up straighter. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said. Elena raised an eyebrow. No, he admitted. I don't deserve that yet. The honesty surprised even the manager, who glanced over nervously. Alexander continued. But if Lydia really raised you alone because of something my family did, then I owe both of you more than an apology. Elena watched him carefully. And what exactly do you think you owe us? Alexander answered without hesitation. The truth. For a moment, Elena didn't respond. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Then she spoke quietly. My mom is sick. Alexander froze. What? She's been sick for a while, Elena said. The words hit him harder than anything else that night. What kind of sick? He asked. Elena hesitated. Doctors say it's treatable, but treatment is expensive. Alexander stared at her. And she's been handling that alone too? Elena nodded. Alexander slowly pushed his chair back and stood. This time his movement wasn't angry or arrogant. It was purposeful. Take me to her, he said. Elena studied him for several seconds. You're serious? I've never been more serious in my life. The tension in the room felt different now. Less explosive. More uncertain. Elena finally reached down and picked up the necklace from the table. She placed it gently back around her neck. Then she looked at him. If you're lying, or if you're just doing this to ease your conscience. Alexander shook his head. I'm not. She held his gaze for another long moment. Finally, she said quietly, then finish your dinner. Alexander blinked. What? Elena allowed the faintest hint of a smile. You're still a customer. Even Alexander couldn't help letting out a quiet breath of disbelief. And for the first time that night, the tension between them shifted into something else. Something uncertain, but hopeful, because the next step in their story wouldn't happen in a restaurant. It would begin when Alexander Hale finally came face to face with the woman he thought he had lost forever. Lydia Carter. The drive across the city felt longer than it should have. Alexander Hale sat in the back seat of his car, staring out the window as the glittering skyline slowly gave way to quieter streets and older apartment buildings. Elena sat beside him in silence. For the first time since their confrontation at the restaurant, neither of them had much to say. Alexander's mind was racing. 20 years. 20 years of unanswered questions, buried memories, and a life he had built without knowing the truth. He glanced briefly at Elena. Now that he knew what he was looking for, the resemblance was impossible to ignore. Her eyes, the shape of her smile, even the stubborn determination in the way she held herself. It was like looking at pieces of the past he had once loved. Here, Elena said quietly. The car slowed in front of a modest apartment building. It wasn't run down, but it was far from the luxurious world Alexander was used to. The paint on the walls had faded, and the small balcony railings showed signs of age. Alexander stared at the building for a moment. She lives here, he asked softly. Elena nodded. For the past 8 years. Alexander felt something tighten in his chest. He had penthouses across the city, homes that overlooked oceans, properties he barely even visited, and Lydia had been living here. The car stopped. Neither of them moved immediately. Finally, Elena opened the door. Come on, she said. Alexander stepped out onto the sidewalk. For a moment he felt strangely nervous, something he hadn't experienced in years. Boardroom negotiations, billion-dollar deals, public interviews. None of them had ever made his heart race like this. They walked toward the entrance. The hallway inside smelled faintly of detergent and old wood. Elena climbed the stairs slowly. "Third floor," she said. Alexander followed. Each step felt heavier than the last. At the top of the stairs, Elena stopped in front of a small apartment door. For a moment she hesitated. Alexander noticed. "What is it?" he asked. Elena looked at him carefully. "She doesn't know you're coming." Alexander swallowed. "That's probably for the best." Elena knocked gently. A few seconds passed. Then they heard footsteps. The door opened. Standing in the doorway was Lydia Carter. Time had changed her, but not as much as Alexander expected. Her hair, once long and dark, now held strands of silver. Her face carried the quiet marks of years spent working hard and worrying too much. But her eyes were the same. Strong, kind, and unmistakable. At first she only looked at Elena. "Hey, sweetheart," Lydia said softly. "You're home late." Then her gaze shifted. She saw the man standing behind her daughter. The words died on her lips. For a moment she simply stared. Alexander felt the world around him go silent. "Lydia," he said quietly. Her eyes widened. The color drained from her face. For a few seconds she looked as if she might collapse. "Alexander," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "It's me." Elena stepped aside, allowing the two of them to face each other fully. Neither of them spoke. 20 years of distance stood between them. Finally Lydia found her voice. How are you here?" Alexander glanced briefly at Elena. "She found me." Lydia looked at her daughter, confusion crossing her face. "What?" Elena crossed her arms gently. "Long story." Lydia looked back at Alexander. Her expression was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something else he couldn't quite name. "After all these years," she said softly. Alexander took a careful step forward. "I didn't know," he said. Lydia frowned. "Know what?" Alexander hesitated. Then he said the words that had changed everything. "That you were pregnant." The room fell silent. Lydia's breath caught. Slowly, she looked at Elena. Then back at Alexander. Her voice barely came out. "You mean you really didn't know?" Alexander shook his head. "No." Lydia closed her eyes briefly, as if the weight of 2 decades had suddenly shifted. "All this time," she whispered. Alexander's voice was filled with regret. "I thought you left me." Lydia let out a small, sad laugh. "And I thought you rejected me." They stared at each other. Two people whose lives had been shaped by a lie neither of them had chosen. Finally Lydia looked again at Elena. Her voice trembled slightly. "You told him?" Elena nodded. "He deserved to know." Alexander looked at Lydia with a seriousness he hadn't shown in years. "I should have been there," he said quietly. "For both of you." Lydia didn't answer immediately. She simply studied his face, as if trying to recognize the boy she once loved inside the man standing in front of her. Finally, she stepped aside from the doorway. "You might as well come in," she said softly. Alexander stepped into the small apartment. The place was simple but warm. Family photographs sat on a shelf. Most of them showed Elena growing up. Alexander felt another wave of emotion hit him. 20 years of moments he had missed. Lydia closed the door behind them. For the first time since he had arrived, the three of them stood in the same room. An unfinished family, but no longer strangers. And for the first time in 2 decades, their story was finally beginning again. The small apartment felt quieter than before. Alexander stood near the window, staring at the city lights in the distance. For years he had looked down at those same lights from the top floors of luxury buildings. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he was standing in a place that held something far more important than wealth. Memories. Behind him, Lydia sat on the couch while Elena stood nearby, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed. For several minutes, none of them spoke. Finally, Lydia broke the silence. "So," she said softly, "you're really one of the richest men in the country now." Alexander gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "So they say." Lydia studied him carefully. "You always said you wanted to build something big." Alexander looked down. "I did. But you didn't come looking for me again." The words weren't angry, just honest. Alexander didn't try to defend himself this time. "You're right," he admitted quietly. The room fell silent again. Then he continued. "I told myself you had moved on. That maybe you didn't want to be found." Lydia shook her head slowly. I waited for you for a long time. Alexander felt the weight of those words more than anything else she had said. Across the room, Elena watched both of them closely. It was strange seeing the two people who had shaped her life standing together like this. Alexander turned toward her. I owe you an apology, he said. Elena raised an eyebrow. For yelling at you in the restaurant? That too, he said. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. But mostly, he continued, for missing 20 years of your life. Elena didn't answer immediately. She glanced at the framed photos on the shelf, pictures of birthdays, school events, graduations. Moments her mother had carried alone. Finally, she looked back at him. You can't change the past, she said. I know, but you can decide what you do next. Alexander nodded slowly. That's exactly what I want to do. Lydia watched him carefully. And what does that mean? Alexander took a deep breath. It means I want to help, he said. With everything. Lydia frowned slightly. We're not charity cases, Alexander. I know, he replied quickly. That's not what I meant. He looked directly at her. Elena is my daughter. The words felt powerful when he said them. And if you'll let me, I want to be part of her life. Elena crossed her arms again. That's going to take time. Alexander nodded. I'm not expecting miracles. Then he looked at Lydia again. And you shouldn't have to face your health problems alone. Lydia looked surprised. Elena told you? Alexander nodded. I spoke with one of the best medical specialists in the country on the way here. Both women stared at him. You did what? Elena asked. He's ready to see you tomorrow, Alexander said gently. Lydia looked overwhelmed. That must cost. It doesn't matter, Alexander interrupted softly. For a moment Lydia looked like she might protest again. But then she saw the sincerity in his eyes. For the first time that night, her expression softened. Maybe, she said quietly, people really can change. Alexander smiled faintly. I'm hoping so. Elena looked between them both. You know, she said, this is still really weird. Alexander chuckled softly. Tell me about it. For the first time since he arrived, the tension in the room eased. Later that night, Alexander stood near the door preparing to leave. He turned back toward them. I'll come by tomorrow morning, he said. Elena nodded. Lydia walked him to the door. For a moment they stood there in silence. Thank you for coming, she said softly. Alexander shook his head. No. He glanced toward the living room where Elena stood. Thank her. Lydia followed his gaze. She's stubborn, Lydia said with a small smile. Alexander smiled too. She gets that from you. Lydia laughed quietly. And for the first time in 20 years, the sound didn't feel like a memory. It felt like a beginning. Alexander stepped into the hallway and paused for a moment. For the first time in decades, the billionaire who had built an empire finally understood something he had been missing all along. Success wasn't measured by money. It was measured by the people who stood beside you when everything else faded away. And now, after 20 lost years, he finally had a chance to build the one thing he had never truly had before. A family. We have come to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.